Hi, Nirmal, and hi, everyone watching. This is Hannah Jones. I work at the University of Warwick in the Department of Sociology, and today I'm talking to Nirmal Puwar from Goldsmiths in the University of London about archival methods and the particular questions around the body as archive. Nirmal, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Hannah. Yes, as Hannah said, I'm at Goldsmiths in sociology. I've been there since 2003, and I always love doing anything with methods. I teach it for undergraduates, postgraduates, and have published a few things on methods, including live methods with my colleague Les back. Some of you might know that collection.
Thanks, Nirmal. And there's so many things we could talk about around methods, I think, but today we're going to try and be focused.
Yeah.
Um, and we thought we'd talk about your concept of carrying as method, um, and the ideas around carrying as method and bodies as archive that you talk about in an article in Body and Society published in 2020. So I wondered if you could first say something about what those concepts mean and how you came to them.
Yes, it's the articles here. As you know, once you've published something and you go back to it, and sometimes one's surprised by what one wrote, and sometimes one is puzzled. But I'm actually still quite surprised that this has come together because it had quite unruly beginnings. I wrote this article from teaching for about 5 years on epistemology and the archive for my feminist MA feminist course. So, firstly, on the notion of carrying, I use it in a double sense to think about the researcher being an embodied being. So, we have our own stories, we have our own biological constitution, we have our own histories, and not that we always know them, but we certainly embody them and carry them. And the second aspect is to think of the participants, our researchers that we work with. They are also embodied in the same sense. And when we enter an exchange of research, we're doing a third element where we're taking forward or carrying in different using different methods, different capacities, different relationships and devices, um, our relationships with them. So it's actually, I said it's two elements of carrying, but it's three elements once you introduce the researcher interacting with the participants. And there are many ways in which this concept emerged. We often think of carrying as something that's in a bag, yes? And some of you may know Ursula Le Guin's essay, very small essay, but beautifully written, called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And she talks about how most of our stories are come from the notion of a hunter. One hunted, territory was made. Rather than thinking about how homes were made, how places were made through carrying, grains, produce, sticks. And carrying has also been used in migration studies quite a lot. So the suitcases one carried, the objects one carries, the photograph one carried. In Seventh Man, John Berger discusses the photograph. Half of the photograph one takes on a journey and leaves the other half behind with the family. And when they've safely reached their journey, this is in the 70s, they send the photograph back. It's actually, I found it a really productive term, but I also come to it through, uh, you know, feminist theory of embodiment, as well as people like Bourdieu, who thinks about our habitus, our comportment, and this is something we often unconsciously carry. Um, and there was something in particular I had been carrying for some time, which was related to the songs that I grew up with as a child, folk songs in female spaces, often informal spaces. And these were spaces, because they were quite transgressive spaces where women undertook kind of drag, risque moves, lots of banter, as well as a lot of lament. And so that was my background in my education, informal education. And I knew I wanted to work on this, but I never did it. So I often say to my students, you've been carrying something. I'm sure you have some snippets, some sounds, some trauma, something that's delightful, but you wanted to do a project on it and you never found the time to do it. And let's just sit with that. Just sit, give it a bit of space. Um, and I actually used to teach like that while I was still carrying this project of songs. And I only came to activate it when actually it's very personal. When my mother's dementia advanced, and as a family, we realized that singing was the way, singing the songs that she was used to from the age of 10 onwards to 30 plus, her own autobiography would allow us to remain connected with her. So it's a way of striking a chord in a double sense, in that maternal sense, but also the connection with her. And that takes us to the issue of archive, which I've learned from feminist theory, post-colonial theories, that it sits in the paper or in between the paper, official archives. Often one has to read in between the lines or along the grain, even against the grain, as Stoller, Spivak, Sundarajan, Latamani have showed us. And so this kind of was my informative baseline, I guess, as well as the work of Grace Cho, Haunting of a Korean Diaspora. And that book has been really significant because she looks at the way in which different histories of sexual violence are silenced transnationally, and also they're carried and they manifest themselves in mental illness sometimes. And her point was to actually listen to that mental illness. And in her latest book, in fact, on Taste Like War, she works with her mother's recipes constituted through war and shared with her. So that's the notion of the body as an archive. The body is an archive of memory, of being, of delight and trauma. Um, and with dementia, we know that music is one of the elements that remains. It remains even when other speech goes. So often we would find in my house with my mum, if we started to sing and tap one of the songs she used to sing with us, it's a very social way of singing. It's not a kind of a singular way of singing. She would pick up the words, and the tempo would build up. And the body as archive also comes from scholars like Anne Chekovich, where she just opens up, what is an archive? And she addresses that an archive is also an archive of feelings. Yes, it's, the paper in the formal archives, it's our objects at home, it's what we have in our phone, perhaps, but it's also a set of feelings. And she worked with lesbian and queer communities that she was a part of in New York and in movements such as ACT UP, and looked at the notions of shame, delight, pleasure that are part of this archive of feelings. And I guess for me, we were tapping into through singing. There's a whole international initiative called Singing for the Brain, run by the Alzheimer's Society, which builds on the body as archive of song in this instance. And I activated that with my sister, my family, my nephews. So that's how the notion of archives is really opened up. And it assumes a notion of history. Something is embedded somewhere. It's not fixed, it's actually moving as well. It's a live archive, or what Stuart Hall might call a living heritage that we can activate in particular ways. And I'm interested in that process, what researchers can do as carriers. What can we activate? And as you know, I've worked in a number of archives differently.
Yeah, that's there's so many things in there, and there's so many things in your article as well. I'm trying to think of how to ask questions in a succinct way to hear more. And I think one of the things you brought out there around haunting, as a methodology for thinking about archives, but also the silences or what points us to absent presence, um, is an important aspect of a question that students often ask. Well, how can you study haunting, or how can you study something that's not there? And do you think that connects to this idea of ways of seeing as embodied and archival?
Yeah, and often the body is very much involved in finding what's not there. I mean, I'm thinking of Carolyn Steedman's work, her book Dust, and a famous essay, Landscape of a Good Woman. And in the book Dust, she has a chapter called Archive Fever. Um, it's a very visceral essay, and she discusses the way in which she's looking at particular archives around households and labour. And when she goes back to as a researcher to her, hotel room, she's tossing and turning between these sheets, trying to make sense of what's in the box. So she's very much haunted by it as a researcher. And, she looks for figures that might be there or they're spoken for already, and the dead can't speak back. If they're dead, if the archive is addressed to those who are no longer with us. So there are big ethical issues involved in an archive as well. Um, and yeah, lately I have been working with these songs because first I activated them with my mum in a very practical way. So this body of archive that was shared, we brought it into the room to connect right till the time she left us, to be honest. And she was 98 by then. So um, we've tried to work with this archive. I think it's also worth thinking through how the work of doing that archival research is very context specific. So when I did a project on war, I'm thinking about today because it's 11th of November, and there's a lot on nation making and memory and war and red poppies in our case, although we know black and white and purple poppies do exist for animals and pacifism. Um, when I went to the Imperial War Museum and looked at the archives there, I was told that I could have free use of the archives in terms of copy of the archives if I had a family member in those archives. The problem was my father was what's called a sapper, so a regular engineer soldier in the British colonial army in India, and nothing is named. His name doesn't feature, so I can't even say he's in those archives. We would be searching for them, for his presence, or some signature of his presence, some trace of his presence. And I have photographs of him when he was a young soldier, so we might be trying to match them in the film. But the labour, was what was worth dwelling on, I think, in thinking about hauntology and absences. The labor of doing that work is incredibly taxing because you've gone into this official colonial space and you can actually feel the violence in the erasure. Uh, and you have to kind of find a way of coping with that, to be honest, and get over it, I suppose, or historians would say. But to use that as a creative force, the absence as a creative force, and in the piecing together, um, as Saidia does in her work on Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments, where she looks at these official depictions of these young black women, in the States. And they're usually not, very endearing. They're kind of criminalizing, in fact, and denigrating. But she does the creative work of showing the experiments in living they were enacting with gender, sexuality, and race. So I guess you need to have that playful, speculative fabulation, as she calls it, move between the archives. And yeah, the way I did it with the war archives was to collaborate with musicians, filmmakers, and other academics.
Yeah, those we'll include all of those things you've mentioned in the reading list resources so people can find out more. But that idea of the creative force of being creative in this kind of work, you, whether that's working with film or poetry or music or fic- fictionalizing or semi-fictionalizing in that critical fabulation way that Hartman does, it seems to sit at odds, I think, for some more scientific ideas about how research is done, and so does the idea around the body as archive, really, in the way you're
Mm.
talking about this project, is it's very organic and doesn't have a starting point that you can point to. So do you have any advice for scholars trying to do this kind of work in the framework of a university, even just the case of trying to do literature review, method design, and separate out those stages in the way that we're taught to do in standard methods
Yeah,
courses?
yeah. I guess that basic book we study at Goldsmiths with first years, C. Wright Mills's Sociological Imagination. I say basic, but it is actually. There's so much in that book. Uh, that gives you a kind of license. Um, I remember the lines in there when C. Wright Mills says, when you find your topic that you're obsessed with, you find that you will roam everywhere. Your imagination will roam everywhere. And he often said that at that time in the 50s, the sociological imagination was found more so in literature, in fiction, than in sociology. So I would say give yourself a license to go off in different places. And yes, you're not going as a specialist. So when I'm stuck, I go to art libraries, or I go to exhibitions, or I take a walk. And you almost need to take a sideways move and allow yourself to read beyond the discipline, I think. And then you will always come back to your discipline. You'll bring something back. Of course, you go as a guest into those disciplines, but then you come back and mutate your discipline. And of course, it depends on your institutional remit, what you're allowed to do. You know, I'm speaking from a place that's very interdisciplinary at Goldsmiths. It's small. We work with colleagues across departments, and yeah. So if you find that you need to read, I mean, right now I'm writing a book based on a 1 mile walk, and I'm listening to what soil scientists say, what botanists say about this walk, as well as someone like Avery Gordon on ghostly matters. But I've also picked up texts I wouldn't have. This is on English pastoral writing. So I guess I allow myself to undertake that kind of braiding, the work of braiding. If you think you're braiding, intermixing, weaving, what Haraway calls that cat's cradle that you're forging, and you can be led by the knots that interest you. So the knot that interested me in this case was, um, yeah, we're all carrying these questions in particular ways. When we talk about the books we carry, we don't talk about the kind of questions and biographies we carry in our research. And to sit with those knots and allow yourself to take them apart. So I guess for the dementia work, I did do a lot of reading on dementia music. And some of that came out of science, some of that came out of humanities. Um, and I didn't allow myself, well, I wouldn't say didn't allow, I wasn't bothered. You might call it promiscuous, but, we're here to work on a problem and to I would say, just let the sociological imagination roam. Now, that can be a problem because you can roam on forever. And I would say I have that problem because there's so many things to read. And But you do have to create a demarcation for that. But if there's a particular archive you want to work with, I mean, maybe there's a family album you want to sit with, um, to just pull out 3 or 4 texts from the reading list I mean, I do always go between my research material, research object, and reading. I always shuttle between the two. So even when I give myself a big license to explore, I do go back to some of my, let's call it, core sociological reading. Um, yeah, I think it allows you to live in the subject differently and to open
So
the
yeah,
subject up.
so yeah, so thinking about the sociological imagination, I often using C. Wright Mills talk about public issues and private troubles and the
Yes.
connections between them, and that's the
Mm,
imagination. But also, you're saying that is at the almost that's the problem, and maybe the not the question the not is the data. So the puzzle that
mm,
people have been carrying
yes.
is the data they're trying to unpick and using tools from wherever
Yeah.
they might find them.
Yeah, the knots are the data that the very making, you're making knots as well. You're tying these knots, So I might be tying the knot of literature and dementia and music as well as on archives. You're tying these knots. So they're making the data. The data is not outside of us. And to think about what kind of braided analysis you're going to undertake. Clearly, you're going to have a priority. You can't do everything everywhere. And you just have to say, as I say to my students, well, what can you sort of put in the appendix or let go of for now, but not put in the bin, just leave it in the file. And what must you work on? And you'd be really offended if you weren't able to work on. So run with that for now. And all the other issues will come and percolate. Yeah.
So that's your advice. Be
Hmm.
promiscuous in the reading and
Yeah,
the thinking,
promiscuous but focused,
but
I
with a
would say,
focus.
with a
Mm,
focus. And to think about what's really driving you here and now, and how you're going to let it drive you.
yeah,
Yeah, I
great.
mean, I could have gone down loads of paths, and I didn't. I could have incorporated psychoanalysis, and I didn't.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I'm sure we'll try to get you to make another video with us again soon. So
Oh yeah, I
thanks
look
for
forward to seeing what the students make of their archives and the body as archive.
I'm going to stop the recording.